Hey now, good day, my beautiful children. Today is Monday, May the 11th, and we're going to finish up our discussion of the Vietnam War, talking about what happened at the very end. So, um, the Vietnam War for the United States, at least as far as our involvement goes, it starts in the early 1960s, very slowly with the United States acting as observers, and then President Johnson, after the death of President Kennedy, escalates the war by reinstating the draft and by adding more troops. And by the mid to late '60s, we're neck deep in it, and this is going to continue on into the 1970s until uh, Richard Nixon gets elected. And Richard Nixon was a Republican, and he is elected. And of course, everybody remembers Nixon for Watergate and for being the only U.S. president to resign while in office. But he's going to be the president that essentially brings an end to American involvement in the Vietnam War. And one of his campaign promises is that he's going to withdraw troops, and he begins to do that. So, uh, by the way, Lyndon Johnson, the war took a real toll on him. Remember, he took over after Kennedy was assassinated, and then he had his own term of office. He did not seek reelection. He would have been the Democratic nominee for to run, and he did not. He quit. He said, "I'm done. I don't want to. I don't want another 4 years in office," and so he left. I mean, he might have been defeated anyway, but we'll never know because he cut and ran. So Nixon's plan is called Vietnamization. The idea is to slowly begin to withdraw U.S. troops and let the bombing do the talking and increase the air war, and also to have the South Vietnamese, the ARVN troops, step up and fight for their own country. And so that's kind of his plan. Very similar to what we did in Iraq, actually. Um, so they begin peace talks to try and end this thing, and they're called the Paris Peace Accords. And eventually a ceasefire is called, and both sides agreed to cease all violence. And essentially, this ends the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but not the war itself, because at this point we still have the South Vietnamese who are democratic. Oh, my dog just rolled in here. Say hi, Copper. We still have the South Vietnamese trying to remain democratic and independent, and we still have North Vietnam trying to spread communism to the south. So that still has to kind of shake itself out, and it's gonna. Even and what's going to happen is once the U.S. leaves, that's it. I mean, the North is going to engulf the South, and that was only a matter of time. And so that's what ends up happening. Um, so the last of the U.S. forces were withdrawn in March of 1973, and this just opened up the floodgates for the communist forces of the North and also the Viet Cong in the South to overrun South Vietnam. And this is a picture, very iconic picture of the last Americans leaving the U.S. embassy in South Vietnam. And this, if you watch the video of this is nuts because it was um, some of the last people to leave. It was as the South Vietnamese were actually entering the area into the city, and you can hear the gunfire, and these people are fleeing for their lives. And it was kind of like anybody who left got out alive, and anybody who had to stay that had been fighting the North, they got to stay and die. That's kind of how it worked. And there are all these images. So these helicopters were taken off from the embassy from the roof, and then they would land on aircraft carriers. And they had so many people coming in, and this was going so quickly that they would, once a helicopter would land, they wouldn't even let it take off because there was nowhere to land it safely anyway. They just shoved it off the aircraft carrier, off the deck of the carrier, into the ocean and let it sink. So these, people saw this on TV, and this is very moving. And when you talk to people about their lasting images of the Vietnam War, this is one of the things that sticks in people's minds because it was for the U.S. humiliating. We were involved. We did not win. Now, again, technically, this was not a war because Congress didn't declare war, but we got our butts handed to us. We could not beat the North Vietnamese on their home turf. There wasn't, there are a lot of reasons for this. The jungle, obviously, and the way that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army conducted guerrilla warfare, and But the other thing is that the United States as a public, we just weren't behind this war like we were World War II, and then that meant that neither was Congress. And there were all these different things. Everybody thought air war would win it, and we talked about why the Operation Rolling Thunder didn't work. There was some talk briefly about using nukes, but nobody wanted to relive Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And at the end of the day, we could not win a land war in Southeast Asia in the jungles of Vietnam against the people there. We didn't have the stomach for it, and didn't want to let this play out any longer. So we leave. So Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam, and when Saigon fell, and when North Vietnamese troops marched into there, that ended it. And from that point on, um, there was no North Vietnam or South Vietnam. It was just Vietnam, and the whole country was now communist. So if you talk about why we were there in the first place, because of domino theory, not wanting, and containment policy and Truman Doctrine, that all failed. Vietnam became totally communist after Saigon fell, and Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and is to this day. So, right as we speak, as we're sitting here, there is no South Vietnam. It is Vietnam, and they are still communist. So here are some images of the people from South Vietnam that had fought against communism, trying to get out of the country. And like I told you, if they didn't get out with the U.S., they didn't get out, and most of them were killed by the communist forces when they came in. As you see, I mean, when this went down, it was nuts. People were trying to jump on these helicopters, and a lot of them were afraid that they'd be overloaded and would crash, and people were fighting to get on the last couple of these helicopters. It's almost like the Titanic and the lifeboat situation. So here are the end results of the Vietnam War. It's estimated that over 3 million total deaths resulted from this war, although it's very difficult sometimes to get an accurate body count, because the Viet Cong would usually take their dead with them after a firefight, or the bodies would be lost in the jungle, and you just couldn't really tell. But 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives there. And I don't know if you've seen this, but many people are like comparing the deaths from COVID-19 to the Vietnam War, and are saying now that more people have died in the United States from coronavirus than during the Vietnam War, which I guess is true. 400,000 South Vietnamese were killed, and over 900,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were killed. But again, these are estimates. We don't really know. There were over 300,000 Americans wounded. There were over 10,000 Americans that were captured and remained prisoners of war. They were supposed to have been returned as part of the Paris Peace Agreement or Peace Accord, but there were rumors that there were still Americans there, and there have been a lot of movies that have come out about people going into to rescue them, and that's what Rambo Part 2 is all about. Um, and then, of course, the lingering issues I mentioned earlier in the unit. How many soldiers contracted diseases or cancer from Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants, and then of course PTSD. A lot of people came home with severe depression and anxiety and things like that. Um, anyway, in 1989, it took over a decade for the U.S. to finally recognize Vietnam as a sovereign nation and begin dealing with them. Our relationship with them today now is pretty decent. You can go to Vietnam tomorrow if you wanted to to tour it. And to this day, Vietnam still remains communist. It's one of the few communist nations left on Earth. So there you go. That's the end results, the end of the war. Hope you guys enjoyed the unit. We'll be moving on next to talk about China and the Chinese Revolution. And that'll probably be about the last thing we do for this school year. So I don't know if you're excited to hear that. I'm not. I'm sad. We had so much more to get to. We never got to Africa. We never got to Latin America, but it is what it is. So that's kind of where we're going to end things. I will see you guys tomorrow. You'll be off to work on the worksheet dealing with the Vietnam War. and then we'll pick back up on Wednesday, I believe, with the Chinese Revolution. So there you go. Peace and love. I'll see you guys on Wednesday.